She rode into town and stole my heart. Welcome to the world of Western romance. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sun was a merciless hammer over Redemption Gulch, beating down on the dusty thoroughfare and bleaching the life from the weathered clapboard buildings that lined it. It was a heat that baked the ambition out of most men, leaving them content to seek the cool, dark solace of the saloon. For Marshal George, however, the heat was just another fixture of the day, a constant presence he acknowledged but refused to yield to. He stood with his thumbs hooked in his belt, his tall frame casting a long, sharp shadow near the supply wagon at the center of town. His presence was a deterrent, a quiet promise of order in a world that perpetually threatened to unravel into chaos. Under the brim of his black cowboy hat, his bright blue eyes missed nothing, cataloging the slow rhythm of the town he protected. The tired sway of the saloon doors, the clink of the blacksmith's hammer, the lazy swirl of dust kicked up by a passing horse. He was a man carved from the very grit and determination the West demanded. His quiet authority, a more effective weapon than the Colt peacemaker that rested comfortably on his hip. It was in the midst of this oppressive, familiar stillness that he saw her. A flicker of movement on the horizon, slowly resolving from a heat-hazed mirage into the distinct shape of a lone rider. That in itself was enough to narrow his eyes. Lone riders were common enough, but a lone woman was a rarity, an event that immediately set the town's silent alarm bells ringing. She rode not with the desperate haste of someone fleeing trouble, nor the aimless wander of a lost soul, but with a steady, determined pace that spoke of a clear purpose. As she drew closer, details emerged that did little to solve the puzzle of her arrival. Her horse was a sturdy mare, not a dainty show pony, and it moved with the same weariness as its rider. The woman herself seemed a contradiction, her form elegantly defined by a dusty, dark blue dress that, despite its practicality for travel, did a poor job of hiding a magnificent hourglass figure and the swell of a generous bosom. Messy curls of hair, the color of sun-scorched wheat, had escaped the pins meant to tame them, framing a face that was both beautiful and etched with fatigue. She rode into the center of town and dismounted with a fluid grace that surprised him, landing on the ground not with the clumsy thud of an amateur, but with the quiet competence of someone who had spent countless hours in the saddle. For a long moment, she simply stood, her brown eyes scanning everything, taking in the town not as a weary traveler seeking refuge, but as a surveyor assessing a piece of land. Her gaze lingered on the sheriff's office, the general store, the grand two-story hotel, and finally it settled on him. George felt the weight of that look, the intelligent appraisal within it. Pushing off from the post he was leaning against, he moved toward her, his long strides eating up the distance. He stopped a respectful few feet away, touching the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone. "Looking for something or someone?" Ellen turned fully to face him, and he got his first clear look at her. Her face was heart-shaped, with a small, button nose dusted with a constellation of light freckles. It was a face that belonged in a parlor, not coated in the grime of the trail. Yet her eyes held a strength that her delicate features. "I'm looking for the stable, and then the hotel," she replied, her voice even and clear, betraying none of the exhaustion that was plain to see in the slump of her shoulders. He saw the way she held herself, a careful mixture of pride and defense. George felt an unexpected and immediate pull, a sharp jolt of interest that was entirely separate from his duties as marshal. He was struck by her, plain and simple, and the realization was as foreign as it was potent. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder. "Stable's down that way. Tom's a fair man. Hotel is the big building right there, can't miss it. Mrs. Gable runs a clean house." Their exchange was brief, purely functional, yet underneath the simple words, a current of unspoken curiosity flowed between them. He saw the weariness in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else, a deep, guarded secret. And he knew, with the certainty of a man who understood human nature, that she was going to be trouble. Later that afternoon, George found himself drifting toward the general store, telling himself he needed to check in on the cantankerous old proprietor. The truth, he knew, was that he was hopping to catch another glimpse of the mysterious woman. He got his wish. Ellen was standing at the counter, a small pile of goods beside her, while squinted at her with his usual sour expression. "Flour, beans, coffee. You planning on staying a while, missy?" grumbled, his voice like rocks grinding together. "That's my business," Ellen answered coolly, her chin held high. "Just ring up my supplies." George watched, amused, as intentionally fumbled with the items, his displeasure at serving an unfamiliar face palpable. Deciding to intervene before his grumpiness curdled the air completely, George stepped forward. He said, his tone casual but firm. "Let's not make the lady wait all day." Shot him a venomous look, but his demeanor changed instantly. He grumbled under his breath but began totaling the cost with newfound efficiency. Ellen turned, her brown eyes showing a flicker of surprise and gratitude. "Marshall," she acknowledged with a slight nod. George gave her a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Here just needs a little encouragement to remember his manners." He paid for his own tin of coffee and, seeing her gathering her parcels, stepped in. "Allow me." Before she could protest, he had gathered her supplies in his arms. "It's on my way," he lied smoothly. The walk to the hotel was short, but it felt charged with a significance that belied its brevity. He made light of the store owner's foul mood, drawing a reluctant but genuine smile from her. "Does he treat all his customers that way?" she asked, a hint of laughter in her voice. "Only the pretty ones who look like they might have more than 2 cents to rub together," George replied, his compliment delivered so plainly it was almost a simple statement of fact. For the first time, he saw her guard lower, just for a moment, and the witty, charming woman beneath it shone through. It was a brief, heartwarming moment of levity that only served to deepen his intrigue. In the days that followed, Ellen settled into a quiet routine, keeping to herself and volunteering no information about the purpose of her visit. George, however, was a patient man and an observant one. He saw her leaving the hotel early each morning, not to wander the town or socialize, but to walk the dusty outskirts. He watched from a distance as she made inquiries, but she wasn't asking about long-lost relatives or searching for work. Her questions were specific and peculiar. She was asking about the old Founder's Oak, a gnarled, ancient tree that stood alone on a rise at the edge of town, a landmark so old and forgotten that most residents barely paid it any mind. This singular focus was a red flag, a piece that didn't fit into any logical puzzle he could devise. His interest was no longer just personal, it was professional. His instincts, honed by years of keeping the peace, told him that whatever secrets Ellen was carrying were tied to that tree. And he wasn't the only one who had taken notice. Croft, the town's most powerful rancher, a man whose wealth and influence were woven into the very fabric of Redemption Gulch, had begun to pay Ellen special attention. Croft, a man who projected an image of benevolent, fatherly authority, approached her in the street, his offers of assistance and welcome feeling just a little too polished, a little too keen. George watched them from the shade of his office porch, a feeling of unease settling in his gut. He didn't know what Croft's game was, nor what secret Ellen was protecting, but he knew one thing for certain. A storm was gathering over his town, and this beautiful, mysterious woman was standing right at its heart. George found himself caught in a frustrating limbo, a silent tug-of-war between the lawman and the man. Every day, his professional duty compelled him to unravel the enigma that was Ellen, to understand the purpose behind her strange inquiries about a forgotten oak tree, and to decipher the guarded look in her intelligent brown eyes. Her presence was an anomaly in the predictable rhythm of Redemption Gulch, a loose thread that his instincts told him could unravel the entire tapestry of the town if pulled. Yet, every time he saw her, the man within him overshadowed the marshal. He was undeniably drawn to her, to the quiet strength that radiated from her, the flash of wit in her rare smiles, and the sheer, startling beauty of her form, which even a simple, dusty dress could not conceal. This internal conflict left him restless, and he found himself inventing reasons to cross her path, opportunities to glean some small piece of her story while satisfying a deeper, more personal need to simply be near her. He would check on her mare at the stables more often than was necessary, engaging Tom, the stable owner, in idle conversation while his eyes sought her out. One morning he found her there, brushing the horse's coat with long, soothing strokes, a look of quiet contemplation on her face. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "She's a fine animal," he commented, his voice a low rumble. "Looks like she's recovering well from the journey." Ellen didn't jump, but he saw her shoulders tense for a second before she relaxed. "She's strong." "Stronger than she looks," Ellen replied, her voice soft, and George had the distinct feeling she wasn't just talking about the horse. Each conversation was like this, a careful dance of words where he would ask about her comfort and she would answer with polite deflections, her heart remaining a fortress he could not breach. The more she held back, the more determined he became, his suspicion and his attraction twisting together into a single, potent obsession that followed him through his days and haunted his nights. The announcement of a barn dance to celebrate the summer harvest sent a ripple of excitement through the town, and for George, it represented an opportunity. It was a chance to see Ellen outside her self-imposed solitude, to observe her in a social setting, and perhaps, under the spell of music and lantern light, find a crack in her carefully constructed armor. When the evening arrived, the big barn on the edge of town was transformed. The air, thick with the scent of hay and cider, buzzed with laughter and the lively sawing of a fiddle. George stood near the entrance, a silent observer until he saw her. Ellen had made an effort, pinning her messy curls up more securely and trading her dusty blue dress for a clean one of the same color that seemed to shimmer in the warm glow of the lanterns. She looked magnificent, a flower blooming in the dust, and she drew stares from every man in the room. She seemed uncomfortable with the attention, holding a cup of cider with both hands as if it were an anchor. Before George could make his way to her, Croft materialized at her side, his smile wide and predatory. He was a handsome man in a prosperous, silver-haired way, and he exuded a confidence that came from owning half the valley. "Miss Ellen," Croft's voice boomed, overriding the music. "A town celebration isn't complete without its and most beautiful resident gracing the dance floor. Will you do me the honor?" George saw the flash of panic in Ellen's eyes, the way she was cornered by the rancher's suffocating charm. She was about to stammer a refusal when George moved. He crossed the floor in a few long strides, his expression calm but his bright blue eyes fixed on Croft. George said, his tone polite but leaving no room for argument, "I believe I was just about to ask the lady for this dance myself." He extended a hand to Ellen, ignoring Croft's tightening jaw. "Marshall," she said, her voice filled with relief as she placed her hand in his. He led her onto the floor as the fiddler struck up a waltz, and the moment his arm went around her waist, the rest of the barn faded away. They fit together perfectly. The chemistry that had simmered between them in stolen glances and brief conversations now crackled in the space between them. They moved as one, her initial stiffness melting away as she surrendered to his confident lead. He could feel the warmth of her through the thin fabric of her dress, smell the faint, clean scent of soap and woman. "You dance well," she murmured, her face tilted up towards his. "For a man who spends his days kicking up dust," he finished for her, a genuine smile touching his lips. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated connection, a silent understanding that passed between them under the golden light, and in that moment, George knew he was in serious trouble. A few days later, George acted on an impulse he hadn't planned. Seeing Ellen leave the hotel for her now customary morning walk, he saddled his horse and rode to meet her on the path that led out of town. "Walking is fine," he said, reining his horse to a stop beside her. "But if you really want to see the valley, you need a higher vantage point." He gestured to the rolling hills that cupped Redemption Gulch. "I could show you a view that'll make you feel like you can see the whole world." To his surprise, she agreed. He helped her onto her mare, and they rode out together, the silence between them comfortable, companionable. They left the dusty confines of the town behind, climbing a winding trail into the high country. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and sage. When they reached the summit of a low mesa, he dismounted and helped her down. Before them, the valley spread out like a map, a patchwork of green and gold under the vast, blue sky. For a long while, they just stood there, taking it in. It was here, away from the prying eyes and listening ears of the town, that they finally spoke with a semblance of freedom. He told her about his past, how he'd been a ranger down in Texas before taking the job in Redemption Gulch, seeking a quieter life. He spoke of his duty to the town, the weight of the badge and the responsibility he felt for every soul within its borders. In return, she offered a small piece of herself. "I came here to settle a family matter," she said, her voice soft and tinged with a sadness that tugged at his heart. "Something left unfinished a long time ago." He pressed gently, his desire to understand her overriding his caution. "What kind of matter?" She turned away, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon, her profile a beautiful, tragic silhouette against the sky. A sad smile touched her lips. "Some stories are best left buried, Marshall," she said, the finality in her tone closing the door on his questions. The ride back was quieter, but the space between them was now filled with a new tension, a shared intimacy born from the secrets she still kept. George felt more fiercely protective of her than ever, his resolve hardening. He would uncover the truth, not just for the sake of the law, but for her. The simmering threat that George had sensed from Croft finally boiled over one evening in the saloon. The place was crowded, a haze of smoke, and the din of conversation hanging in the air. George was at the bar, nursing a beer, when Ellen walked in. She was only there to deliver a message to the hotel's handyman, but her presence immediately shifted the room's atmosphere. As she turned to leave, one of Croft's hired hands, a big, slovenly man named Cole, deliberately lurched into her path, sloshing the contents of his beer mug down the front of her dress. The dark blue fabric instantly soaked and clung to her, and a collective gasp went through the saloon. Cole let out a braying laugh. "Watch where you're, sweet thing," he sneered, making no move to apologize. Ellen stood frozen, her face pale with shock and humiliation. Before anyone else could react, George moved. He didn't rush. He placed his beer carefully on the bar and turned, his body language transforming from relaxed lawman to something cold, coiled, and incredibly dangerous. He walked toward Cole, his steps silent, his blue eyes like chips of ice. "You owe the lady an apology, Cole," George said, his voice dangerously quiet, yet it cut through the saloon's noise like a razor. Cole, emboldened by liquor and the presence of his friends, puffed out his chest. "I ain't, for she got in my way." George didn't waste another word. In a movement too fast to follow, his hand shot out not for his gun but for the front of Cole's shirt. He twisted, bunching the fabric in his fist, and propelled the much larger man backward, slamming him against the wall with enough force to rattle the bottles on the shelves. He leaned in close, his face inches from Cole's. "You will walk out of this saloon, and you will not come back tonight," George snarled, his voice a low, menacing promise of violence. "And if I ever see you lay a hand on this lady, or even look at her sideways again, you'll be digging your own grave. Do you understand me?" The man, his bravado instantly evaporated, could only nod, his eyes wide with terror. George released him and shoved him toward the door. As Cole stumbled out into the night, George turned back to the silent room. His gaze swept over the faces of Croft's other men, a clear, unspoken warning. Then his eyes found Ellen. He walked to her, his expression softening as he took in her shocked face and ruined dress. He shrugged off his jacket and gently draped it over her shoulders. "Let me walk you back to the hotel," he said softly. As they stepped out into the cool night air, he had made a public declaration. Ellen was no longer just a mystery he was trying to solve. She was under his protection, and he had just drawn a line in the sand directly in front of Croft. The walk from the saloon to the hotel was shrouded in a profound silence, a stark contrast to the boisterous noise they had just left behind. George's jacket was warm and heavy on Ellen's shoulders, smelling faintly of leather, dust, and the man himself. It was an anchor in the dizzying aftermath of the confrontation. The weight of his protective gesture felt far more significant than the simple act of lending a coat. It was a shield, a public declaration that had irrevocably tied their fates together in the eyes of the entire town. She could feel the coiled tension still radiating from him as he walked beside her, his long, steady strides a comforting rhythm in the dark. He hadn't said a word, but his presence was a fortress, and for the first time since riding into this dusty, forgotten town, Ellen didn't feel entirely alone. The humiliation of the attack still stung, but it was overshadowed by a burgeoning sense of hope, a fragile feeling that had taken root the moment she saw the cold fire ignite in George's bright blue eyes. She had spent weeks building walls around her heart and her history, convinced that she had to carry her burden alone, but his quiet, unwavering defense of her had breached those walls in a way no amount of questioning ever could. By the time they reached the door to her hotel room, she knew a decision had been made. The risk of trusting him was immense, but the risk of continuing her quest alone, especially now that she had drawn the open hostility of Croft's men, was far greater. Inside the small, lamplit room, the air grew thick with unspoken words. George closed the door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. He turned to face her, his expression a mixture of concern and a simmering anger that had yet to fade. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and rough with emotion. She could only nod, clutching the lapels of his jacket. Now, in the privacy of her room, the full weight of her secret pressed down on her, demanding to be released. She realized that she had been waiting for a man like this, a man whose strength was not in his fists or his influence, but in his character. She saw the genuine man, the protector, the unwavering lawman who had put himself between her and danger without a moment's hesitation. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she finally let the carefully constructed dam around her heart break. "There's something you need to know, Marshall. Something you have a right to know now that you've done this for me. My reason for being here, for asking about the oak tree." She let go of his jacket and moved to her travel trunk at the foot of the bed. From beneath a layer of clothes, she retrieved a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. With trembling fingers, she unwrapped it to reveal a worn, leather-bound journal, its cover softened with age and its pages yellowed. "This belonged to my father," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "My name isn't just Ellen, it's Ellen." George watched her, his expression unreadable as he processed the name. It held no meaning for him. He had known everyone of consequence in this valley for years, and that name was not among them. Ellen saw the confusion on his face and continued, her words gathering strength as the long-held truth began to flow. "My father was Liam. He was a dreamer, an engineer from back east who saw something in this valley that no one else did. He bought this land, all of it, with a vision of building a town that was fair and just, a place for families to thrive. He called it Redemption Gulch because he believed it was a place where people could find a second chance." She opened the journal, its spine creaking in protest, and turned to a specific page. The ink faded, but the handwriting still clear and full of elegant loops. She didn't read from it directly, but paraphrased, her eyes distant as she recounted the words she had memorized long ago. He wrote about everything, the plans for the grist mill, the layout of the streets, the spot he chose for the first church, and he wrote about Croft. At the mention of Croft's name, George's posture stiffened. "Croft was a young man then, hired by my father as a foreman. My father trusted him, saw him as ambitious and capable. But Croft's ambition was a sickness. He wanted more than a wage, he wanted everything." Her voice cracked with an old, inherited pain. 20 years ago, my father was found dead at the edge of his claim. They said it was a robbery, that drifters had killed him for his pocket watch. A week later, Croft produced a deed, claiming my father had sold him the entire valley in a private deal before his death. With no one to challenge him, he became the town's founder, its benevolent patriarch. The pieces clicked into place in George's mind with sickening clarity. Ellen's secretive nature, her obsession with the founder's oak, Croft's unnerving interest in her. It was all a lie, a history built on a foundation of murder and deceit. He felt a cold dread creep into his soul. This wasn't just about a crime. It was about the very identity of the town he had sworn to protect. Croft was more than a rancher. He was an institution, a man George himself had looked up to as a boy, a symbol of stability and progress. The man who donated generously to the school, who offered work to any man willing to sweat, who sat on the town council and spoke of honor and community. George felt physically ill as his mind replayed years of memories, now tainted by this horrifying revelation. Croft's paternal smiles now seemed like the leers of a vulture, his generosity a way of buying loyalty and silence. The attack in the saloon was no random act of a drunken lout. It was a message, a warning from Croft to the woman who threatened to unearth his original sin. "The deed Croft produced was a forgery," Ellen continued, her voice pulling him from his dark thoughts. She pointed to a passage in the journal. "My father was clever. He was worried about fires, about theft. He created the town charter and the original legal deed to the valley, and he sealed them in a lead box. He wrote it down, right here. He buried that box beneath the main root of the great oak tree at the edge of town, the one he called the Founder's Oak. He planned to unearth it on the town's 25th anniversary, a grand celebration of his dream come true. He was murdered a week after he buried it." She finally looked up at him, her brown eyes swimming with unshed tears but burning with a fierce, unwavering fire. "I'm not here for revenge, Marshall. I'm here for justice. I'm here to reclaim my father's name and the town he meant to build." The revelation struck George with the force of a physical blow, shaking the very foundations of his world. He was the law in Redemption Gulch, but he now understood that the law he'd been upholding was a sham, an elaborate stage play directed by a murderer. His choice was stark and terrible. To continue protecting the comfortable lie the town had lived for 2 decades, or to stand with this woman against a man with the power to crush them both. But looking at Ellen, at the raw courage in her face and the undeniable truth in her story, he knew there was no choice at all. His duty was not to a man or a title, but to the truth, to the real justice that had been buried in the ground for 20 long years. The dynamic between them had shifted in an instant. She was no longer a mystery to be solved, and he was no longer just a curious lawman. They were partners, bound by a dangerous secret and a shared purpose. "Croft knows," George said, his voice grim as he paced the small room. "He must have suspected who you were the moment you arrived. He's been watching you, waiting to see how much you knew." As the words left his lips, a sudden heavy pounding rattled the door, followed by a gruff voice. "Marshall, open up, we know she's in there." It was Cole, the man from the saloon, and he didn't sound drunk anymore. He sounded determined. George's hand went instantly to the butt of his Colt. He looked at Ellen, his bright blue eyes hard as steel. Croft was done waiting. He was making his move. The pounding on the door was a brutal, percussive sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the small hotel room, each blow a hammer strike against the fragile hope that had just begun to blossom between them. George didn't flinch. In an instant, the thoughtful, conflicted man vanished, replaced by the hardened lawman, his entire being sharpened to a fine, dangerous point. He put a single finger to his lips, signaling silence to Ellen, though it was hardly necessary. She stood frozen, her face a pale mask of terror, clutching her father's journal to her chest as if it were a shield. His mind worked with breathtaking speed, assessing the layout of the room, the position of the window, the number of men he could hear shuffling in the hallway. He wasn't a reckless gunslinger who solved problems with a hail of bullets. He was a tactician, a man who survived by outthinking his opponents. He moved with a silent, fluid grace to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. Below, the alley was dark and empty, a potential escape route but also a trap. Another thunderous bang on the door, this time accompanied by the splintering of wood, told him they had mere seconds. He turned back to Ellen, his bright blue eyes locking with hers, conveying a whole conversation without a single word. "Trust me." He grabbed her arm, his touch firm but reassuring, and pulled her toward the wardrobe in the corner of the room. "Marshall, what are you doing?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "They won't stop until they have you," he murmured back, his voice a low, urgent rumble. "And they think I'm the only thing in their way." He flung open the wardrobe, its cedar scent filling the air, and pointed to the back panel. "The walls in this old place are thin. Kick it. Hard." With no time to question his logic, Ellen did as he commanded. She lifted her foot and drove her heel into the flimsy backboard of the wardrobe. It cracked, and with a second, more desperate kick, it gave way, revealing the dark, dusty space between the walls. The pounding on the door ceased, replaced by the grating sound of a crowbar being wedged into the frame. "Go," he ordered, giving her a gentle but firm push toward the opening. "Follow the space to the next room. Don't make a sound." She hesitated, her eyes wide with fear for him. "Your father's fight is my fight now, Ellen. Go." That declaration, the simple, powerful acknowledgement of their shared cause, was all she needed. She scrambled through the opening, disappearing into the darkness just as the hotel room door burst inward with a deafening crash. Cole and another of Croft's thugs spilled into the room, their guns drawn, only to find Marshall George standing alone in the center of the room, his hands empty and a look of cold fury on his face. "You're a little late for a social call, boys," George said, his voice deceptively calm. "And you're going to pay for that door." While Croft's men were tangled in the web of his misdirection, George slipped out of a back window and circled around the hotel, his movements swift and silent in the moonless night. He met a terrified Ellen in the adjoining room, where she had emerged into the space rented by a sleeping prospector, and led her quickly and quietly down a service staircase and into the deep shadows of the livery stable. The scent of hay and horseflesh was a comforting, earthy smell in the midst of the chaos. He didn't take her to his office, which he knew would be the first place Croft would look once he realized his men had failed. Instead, he led her to the blacksmith's forge at the far end of town, a place of fire and iron, a place run by the one man in town George trusted implicitly, a giant of a man named, whose loyalty was as solid as the anvils he worked on. George explained the situation in clipped, urgent tones, the story of Liam's murder and Croft's decades-long deception tumbling out under the crimson glow of the forge's dying embers. Listened, his massive face grim, and when George was finished, he simply nodded once and turned to Ellen. "Your father was a good man. This town has a long debt to him. You are safe here, miss." With Ellen secured, the dynamic between her and George was irrevocably transformed. They were no longer a lawman and a mysterious woman, but true partners, their individual quests forged into one by the heat of imminent danger. She handed him her father's journal, and in the flickering firelight, he studied the hand-drawn map, memorizing the description of the great oak and the precise location of the buried lead box. "He'll be expecting us to go for it," George said, thinking aloud. "He thinks he has us trapped. He'll have men watching the tree." Ellen, her initial terror now replaced with a steely resolve, spoke up. "Then we cannot do what he expects." She looked from George to the array of tools hanging on the blacksmith's wall, a plan forming in her mind, a plan born of the same cleverness that had led her father to bury his legacy in the first place. Under the cloak of the deepest pre-dawn darkness, two figures crept from the blacksmith's shop, moving not toward the main road, but through the back alleys and creek beds that skirted the town. They didn't ride horses, which would have been too loud, too conspicuous. Instead, they moved on foot, carrying with them not just shovels, but a heavy length of chain and a block and tackle from his workshop. When they reached the rise where the ancient founder's oak stood like a lonely sentinel against the star-dusted sky, they saw them. The dark shapes of at least 3 men, positioned in the rocks, waiting for them to walk into their trap. Following Ellen's audacious plan, they didn't approach the tree directly. Instead, they circled wide, using the terrain for cover until they were positioned above the watchers. Working together in whispered commands and silent understanding, George secured the chain high around the trunk of a much smaller, half-dead tree on the slope above the men. They fed the other end through the pulley system, creating a crude but effective winch. Then they began the grueling, tense work of digging, not at the base of the founder's oak, but at the roots of the dead tree they had chained. It was back-breaking labor, the dry earth resisting every bite of the shovel. They worked as a team, their shared purpose a silent, powerful bond between them. He would dig, loosening the earth, and she would clear it away, her hands raw but her movements determined. Finally, with a great, groaning tier of roots, the dead tree shifted, its weight held only by the strained chain. It was a deadfall trap, aimed directly at the rocks where Croft's men were hiding. With a final, shared look, George took a heavy mallet from his belt and struck the release pin on the block and tackle. With a sound like a gunshot, the chain went slack, and the dead tree crashed down the slope with the force of an avalanche, sending dirt, rocks, and splintered wood cascading over the ambush spot. Yells of surprise and pain echoed in the night, followed by chaos as Croft's men, their trap sprung on them, scrambled to escape the debris. The diversion gave them the time they needed. They scrambled down the slope to the base of the great founder's oak, and George began to dig with a desperate urgency, his muscles screaming in protest. The earth was packed hard, tangled with a web of ancient roots, but the words from Liam's journal guided him. Ellen stood watch, her father's rifle held with a steadiness that belied the frantic beating of her heart. The shovel struck something hard with a dull, metallic thud. Working together, they cleared the remaining dirt and heaved the heavy lead box from its tomb of 20 years. It was real. Everything she had risked her life for was real. But their victory was short-lived. A voice, dripping with venom and fury, cut through the darkness. "I have to admit, daughter, you are more clever than I gave you credit for." Croft stepped out from behind the trunk of the massive oak, his benevolent mask completely gone, revealing the cold, ruthless face of a murderer. He held a pistol aimed directly at George's heart. "But your cleverness ends here. Give me the box." George slowly rose, placing himself between Croft and Ellen. "It's over," he said, his voice level. "The truth is out." Croft let out a harsh laugh. "The truth is whatever I say it is. In a few moments the town will hear a tragic story. The brave marshal, killed in the line of duty by a mysterious, desperate woman and her accomplice, who were then brought to justice by me. The town will mourn, and I will remain its benefactor." But as Croft gloated, he failed to notice Ellen, no longer standing watch but moving silently in the deep shadows at the edge of the clearing. He had dismissed her as a mere woman, a pawn in his game. It was his final, fatal mistake. As he raised his pistol to fire, a rifle shot cracked through the night, not from where he last saw her, but from his flank. The bullet tore through his shoulder, sending his pistol flying from his grasp as he screamed in pain and rage. He stumbled back, clutching his arm, his eyes finding Ellen, who now stood in the open, the rifle hot in her hands, her face a mask of cold, righteous fury. The sun was just beginning to bleed over the distant mountains, painting the sky in hues of soft pink and gold as George cinched the ropes binding a wounded and defeated Croft. The other hired hands had been rounded up, their will to fight broken. The lead box sat on the ground between George and Ellen, a testament to a truth that had refused to stay buried. With Croft exposed and the original deed recovered, Ellen's long, lonely quest for justice was finally over. Her father's name would be cleared, and the town he had dreamed of would finally have a chance to become a reality. For a long, heart-stopping moment, George felt a pang of fear that, with her purpose fulfilled, she might leave as mysteriously as she had arrived. He turned to her as the new day's light washed over the valley, illuminating the dust on her clothes and the exhaustion on her beautiful face. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek, and she leaned into his touch. "You rode into town a mystery, Ellen," he said, his voice thick with emotion he no longer tried to hide. "But you're not a mystery anymore. You're the woman who stole my heart, and I'll be damned if I let you ride away with it." A slow, brilliant smile spread across her face, chasing away the last of the shadows. She reached up and placed her hand over his. "Who says I'm going anywhere, Marshall?" she replied softly, her brown eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with the rising sun. "It seems to me my father's legacy is just beginning. Redemption Gulch is going to need a lot of rebuilding, and I imagine I'll need a good, honest lawman by my side to help." He didn't need any more encouragement. He lowered his head and pulled her into a kiss that was not born of heat or desperation, but of shared struggle, mutual respect, and a deep, abiding love that had been forged in the crucible of danger and truth. It was a kiss that sealed their future as the first rays of sunlight crested the hills, promising a new dawn for them, and for the town they would now build together.